You know, living in a quiet suburban neighborhood has its perks. The kind of place where kids ride bikes on freshly paved streets, mail carriers wave as they go, and lawns are always trimmed with precision. But there's a side to it that most people don't talk about. The side that comes with letters, rules, and endless reminders that someone else has a say over your own home, and in my neighborhood. The HOA isn't just a stack of papers and signatures, it's a presence, a shadow hovering over every perfectly manicured hedge. My name's narrator name, and I've lived in this neighborhood for a little over 5 years, and when I moved in, I thought I'd found my little slice of paradise, quiet streets, neighbors who nod hello, and a sense of safety I hadn't experienced in the city. I have a modest 2-story house with a fenced backyard, and if there's one thing I've learned about suburban life, it's that appearances matter more than anything. A perfectly painted mailbox, a lawn edged just so, and you're considered good. A few weeds or a crooked welcome mat, and suddenly, you're a target. I also have my K9 unit, Max. He's not just a dog. He's a partner, a guardian, and honestly, a little overprotective at times. Max is a German shepherd trained in home security and obedience, but his instincts are sharp enough to detect anything or anyone out of place. People often underestimate the bond between a handler and a K9, but it's intense. Max knows my routines, my moods, my comings and goings. He knows when something doesn't belong, and more importantly, he reacts before I even process it. Every morning, I follow a strict routine. I step outside at 6:30, leash Max, and we take a slow walk around the neighborhood. I greet the early joggers, the dog owners, even the occasional mailman who's grown used to my presence. By 7, I'm back, coffee in hand, watching the sun filter through the trees in my front yard. I check the locks, make sure Max has his breakfast, and then I start my workday. Most days, life is predictable, safe, comfortable. But predictability has a way of lulling you into a false sense of security, and that's where Karen comes in. Karen isn't just any neighbor. She's the embodiment of every HOA stereotype you've ever heard. Meticulously organized, highly opinionated, and frighteningly persistent. She never misses an opportunity to make her presence known. Whether it's through subtle digs in a casual conversation or formal complaints delivered in overly polite, threatening letters. She has a reputation in the neighborhood, not for being cruel, but for being relentless. If a hedge isn't trimmed perfectly, she notices. If a driveway has a crack, she files a report. And if she suspects someone is bending or breaking the rules, she'll be the first to make it known. I first noticed her attention about 2 years ago. I had just returned from a week-long business trip and found a neatly folded note tucked under my front door mat. Please be mindful of the HOA guidelines regarding yard maintenance. Thank you, Karen. At first I thought it was harmless, just a friendly reminder, but the tone of the note, the careful handwriting, the way her name was signed like a seal of authority, it was unnerving, not threatening per se, but certainly enough to make me reconsider how I left my front porch during the week. Over time, the small gestures became a pattern. Complaints about the way I parked my car, the placement of my garbage bins, even the angle at which my holiday decorations leaned. At first I tried to laugh it off. Karen's just particular, I'd tell myself. But then the letters started piling up. Always polite, always insistent, always implying that I might be breaking some obscure rule I didn't even know existed. Every time I opened one, Max would perk up. His ears alert, his tail stiff, he seemed to understand that these weren't just papers. They were harbingers of something more. Living under that kind of scrutiny teaches you vigilance. I installed cameras at the front and back of the house. I reinforced the locks on all doors and windows. I even set up motion sensor lights around the property. Max and I became a team in ways I hadn't imagined when I first got him. He patrols the house while I monitor the feed. And together we've developed an almost unspoken communication. If something feels wrong, he lets me know. If someone is near the property when they shouldn't be, I know before they ever ring the doorbell. Despite all my precautions, Karen managed to insert herself into the fabric of my life without ever physically crossing a line. She's subtle, knowing how to push boundaries without stepping over them. Her latest HOA newsletter featured a friendly reminder about maintaining proper property appearance, and though it didn't mention me by name, it might as well have. Max growled softly as I read it, and I felt that familiar chill of unease. It wasn't paranoia, it was instinct. I started noticing little things when I left the house. The way the neighbors' blinds would twitch as I passed, the occasional lingering figure in a yard that shouldn't have had anyone, and the strange feeling of being watched. It's hard to describe unless you've felt it yourself. The sense that someone is quietly monitoring your life, cataloging every detail. I never confronted Karen directly about these feelings. She had a way of looking completely innocent, like nothing had happened at all. One moment she's smiling over the hedge, waving politely, and the next, you realize she's filed yet another concern with the HOA. And that's the thing about people like Karen. They operate in the gray areas, not outright criminals, not overtly hostile, but invasive in ways that chip away at your peace of mind. It's subtle, clever, and infuriating. But Max and I had one advantage: preparation. Every routine, every precaution, every lock and sensor, he and I had covered all the bases, or so I thought. Little did I know. Karen wasn't just going to stick to letters and veiled warnings. She had plans of her own, plans that didn't involve the HOA rules or polite notes, plans that would test every precaution I had put in place, challenge Max's instincts, and force me to confront the fact that some people don't respect boundaries. Some people believe that rules and K-9 units exist only for other people, and that's where our story begins. It started with small things that seemed insignificant at first, the kind of details you might ignore if you weren't already on edge. The neighbor who suddenly lingered a little too long near my driveway, the faint sound of footsteps across the wooden fence in the middle of the night, the subtle movement of blinds that hadn't been there the day before, and at first I chalked it up to paranoia, telling myself Max was just reacting to normal neighborhood noises. But deep down I felt the unease growing, the kind that makes your stomach tighten and your senses sharpen, and Max felt it too, pacing, sniffing, alert to the tiniest shifts in the air, his ears swiveling toward every sound. And that's when I realized this wasn't normal. This was deliberate, and Karen was getting bolder. She had always been meticulous, always precise, always following the rules to the letter, but lately her presence felt invasive in a new way. The subtle glances from her porch as I walked by, the friendly reminders slipped under my door, the HOA emails that seemed innocent but carried an undercurrent of threat, and each time Max's hackles would rise, his growl low and warning, and I started paying closer attention, noticing the patterns, the timing, the way she seemed to appear exactly when I wasn't expecting her. I remember one afternoon I left for a quick grocery run, just 15 minutes, and when I returned, a small potted plant had been moved from the side garden to the front porch. Nothing broken, nothing overt, just an intrusion into my personal space. And yet it was enough to make me pause, to make me realize that Karen didn't respect boundaries. And that subtlety was her weapon. She didn't need to confront me directly. She made her presence felt without stepping over the line. And that ambiguity was dangerous because it made it harder to call her out, harder to prove, harder to anticipate. Max and I tightened our routines. I made sure the cameras were angled differently, the motion lights tested multiple times, the doors double-locked. And yet the tension lingered, an invisible thread connecting my home to hers, the sense that at any moment something could happen. And that's exactly the kind of suspense that gets under your skin, the kind that keeps you checking corners, listening to every sound, noticing every shadow, because with Karen, there was always a shadow lurking, always a subtle threat hiding behind polite smiles and HOA regulations. And it wasn't just the physical security, it was the psychological pressure, the feeling that someone was constantly observing, cataloging, waiting for a moment to strike. And I had to be ready. For me, for Max, for the sanctity of my home. The emails increased in frequency, each carefully worded to imply negligence on my part. Friendly suggestions disguised as warnings, each one a reminder that I was being watched. And every time I read one, Max's gaze followed me. Alert, his stance rigid, his instincts screaming at me that Karen wasn't just overbearing, she was escalating. And soon it would cross the line from annoying neighbor to something far more invasive. Then came the day I left for a long morning meeting, nearly 3 hours away, and the sense of unease had reached a peak. I double-checked the locks, ran through the security feed, and Max sat by the door, alert and tense, as if sensing the impending breach before it happened. And I thought about Karen, Wondered if her curiosity had reached the point where letters weren't enough, if her obsession with control had shifted into action, and I could feel the tension building like a storm just beyond the horizon. The neighborhood seemed quieter than usual, almost eerily so, with only distant sounds of children playing and birds in the trees, the stillness making every creak, every whisper of movement in the wind feel amplified. And as I walked out the driveway, I couldn't shake the feeling of eyes on me, the subtle heat of scrutiny following me even as I drove away. And that's when it hit me. Karen's patience was a mask, and beneath it was a calculated intent, a need to insert herself into my life in ways I hadn't anticipated, a drive that wouldn't be satisfied with mere complaints. While I was gone, she would have the house to herself, and the thought sent a shiver down my spine. But I also trusted Max. I trusted the preparation. I trusted that our routine, our vigilance, could counteract even the most subtle intrusion. And yet, as the minutes ticked by, I realized this wasn't just a mental game. It was a test, a setup to see how far she could push, how boldly she could overstep, and I had to be ready. Because Karen's subtle maneuvers weren't mistakes, they were deliberate, and the line between neighborhood overreach and outright trespass was about to disappear. I knew she would move slowly, checking doors, peering through windows, gauging whether the house was empty, assessing the risk like a predator. And Max would feel her before I ever did, his senses attuned to the slightest anomaly. And that's why every preparation mattered, every precaution mattered, because in that quiet suburban neighborhood, the battle lines weren't drawn with violence, but with cunning, with subtlety, with the invisible game of control that Karen was playing. And as I returned home later that day, the hair on my arm stood on end, my eyes scanning the perimeter, the tension palpable, and I knew without a doubt that the real test had begun, the stage was set, and Karen's calculated moves were about to collide with the force that Max and I represented. The guardianship of our home, the unspoken rules of territory, and the story that had been quietly unfolding was about to escalate into something unforgettable. The morning I left for an extended errand, I felt the familiar knot of unease tighten in my stomach, a warning I had come to trust, Max pacing at my side, his ears swiveling toward every sound, tail stiff, sensing my tension and amplifying it. And as I grabbed my keys and double-checked the locks, I couldn't shake the feeling that today was different, that something about the air, the shadows, the silence of the neighborhood felt heavier, like a warning that Karen's subtle maneuvers were about to escalate into action. And yet I had a schedule to keep, a responsibility to fulfill. So I reassured myself, telling Max to settle, that everything was secure, that he and I had done everything to protect our home. And as I walked down the driveway, the cool morning breeze brushing my face, I couldn't ignore the flicker of movement from the corner of my eye, the almost imperceptible shift in a neighbor's blinds, the way the flowers in Karen's yard seemed to be arranged just so, her gaze hidden but somehow present, and even as I drove away, I could feel her influence lingering over my property, the psychological weight of her attention pressing down even in my absence. Inside the house, Max adjusted seamlessly into his patrol routine, his paws silent on the hardwood floors, nose twitching, tail moving with measured precision as he checked every corner, every window, every doorway, the very walls seeming to vibrate with the tension he sensed. And I pictured him there as I drove, imagining his gaze fixed on the door, the backyard, the driveway, knowing that he would detect the smallest anomaly, the tiniest movement that indicated an intruder. And my mind raced with scenarios, with what-ifs, with the knowledge that Karen's obsession had moved beyond polite reminders and veiled threats. And I realized that the absence of my physical presence would not prevent her from asserting control, from testing boundaries, from seeing just how far she could push. The streets were unusually quiet that day, the distant sounds of life muted, leaving the world outside my home feeling hollow and empty, amplifying the tension I felt. And I wondered how she would approach, whether cautiously, strategically, or with a confidence born from familiarity with the neighborhood. And as I navigated traffic, I couldn't stop thinking about the combination of her persistence and my home's vulnerabilities, about the contrast between her subtle manipulations and the very real protection Max provided, about the invisible line she might soon cross. Minutes felt like hours, each red light, each stop sign, each pause in traffic giving me time to imagine her movements, her meticulous planning, the way she might approach the house from the side path she knew was less visible from the street, how she might test the doors, glance through windows, move quietly, assuming the house was empty, unaware that a trained canine was already attuned to her presence, waiting, and I felt a mix of anxiety and confidence, knowing that every precaution mattered, that every detail of my preparation, every camera angle, every lock, every sensor was part of a delicate balance between safety and intrusion, and that Max was the guardian of that balance, the first line of defense against anyone who didn't belong. As I parked near my destination, I checked my phone for any notifications from the security system, scanning the live feed with the practiced eye of someone who had learned to trust both technology and instinct. And even from miles away, I felt the subtle disturbances, the almost imperceptible hints that something was stirring. The sense that Karen's intentions had shifted from passive oversight to active engagement, and that the house, my sanctuary, would soon be challenged in ways I had only imagined in my worst-case scenarios. I tried to focus on the errands, on the tasks at hand, but every sound, every vibration from my phone, every ping of motion detection pulled me back to the home I had temporarily left behind, reminding me that boundaries are only as strong as the ones willing to respect them. And some people, like Karen, do not respect boundaries. They test them, they probe them, and if unchallenged, they escalate. And I knew that Max, vigilant and unwavering, would be my first and most reliable response, that his training, his instincts, his loyalty were my shield against the intrusion that was about to unfold, and even as I went about my day, I could feel the tension stretching taut, like a coiled spring, waiting for the precise moment to release, to test every precaution, every lock, every sensor, and I realized that absence does not mean safety, that distance does not mean immunity, and that some battles are fought not in the presence of the defender, but in their absence, where only preparation and instinct stand between home and trespass. And I knew, deep in my gut, that the coming confrontation would not be subtle, that the line Karen had skirted for so long was about to vanish entirely, and Max and I had to be ready. The house was silent, too silent. The kind of silence that presses against the walls and makes every creak, every groan of the floorboards sound amplified. And somewhere in the distance a bird chirped, oblivious to the tension building inside, and Karen moved with the precision of someone who believed she was invisible, her footsteps careful, calculated, avoiding the squeaky spots she had memorized from past observations. Each step measured, each breath controlled. Convinced that the house was empty, unaware that Max was already alert. His ears twitching, his body low to the ground, senses stretched to the maximum, picking up the faintest scent, the subtle vibration of a presence that didn't belong. And the moment she stepped onto the threshold, that instinct triggered, a low growl vibrating from deep in his chest. A warning, a declaration, a boundary that could not be crossed. And Karen froze, her confident expression flickering as she processed the unexpected. The fact that someone or something knew she was there. She thought she had planned it perfectly, slipping in unnoticed while I was gone. But she had underestimated the bond between Max and me. The training, the anticipation, the unspoken code that said home equals protection. And Max moved fluid, precise, a shadow gliding between the intruder and the sanctuary. Teeth bared, hackles raised, his eyes fixed on the figure that dared enter. And for a moment time seemed suspended, the tension so thick it could almost be felt physically. Karen's breath quickening, her mind racing for excuses, for explanations, for a way out, and she realized too late that this was no ordinary dog. No passive guardian, but a K9 unit trained to detect, deter and defend. She backed up slowly, glancing at the doors, the windows, the cameras she hadn't noticed. The path she thought was invisible now illuminated by the presence of a protector, and Max's growl deepened. A warning growl that filled the house, echoing through the walls, alerting neighbors, drawing attention, leaving no room for denial, no room for maneuver, no room for escape without consequence, and Karen stumbled over a rug, her carefully rehearsed confidence unraveling. Every step betraying the panic she tried to hide behind forced politeness. And in that moment, The reality hit her. She was caught, exposed, confronted by an unyielding force she had never accounted for. The very thing she assumed didn't exist until now. The silent, watchful, protective presence that had been waiting for her all along. Max advanced cautiously, maintaining control, alert and restrained, his training evident in every movement, circling, observing, ensuring the intruder could not escape, and Karen tried to speak, stammering out excuses, apologies, denials, but the sound of the growl, the precision of his stance, the unbreakable focus in his eyes silenced her words, leaving only the truth. She had crossed a line. She had trespassed, and she would face the consequences. And in the next moments, as the neighbors' doors opened and a few curious voices drifted from yards nearby, Karen's panic escalated, realizing that the drama she had assumed would be private was now public, and she tried to retreat, her movements erratic, miscalculated, as if suddenly aware of every angle, every camera, every possibility for exposure, and Max maintained his position unwavering, a sentinel, a force that transformed the house from a passive space into a fortress. Every instinct, every reflex, every trained response in full display, ensuring that Karen's intrusion would not succeed. She tried to reach the front door, fumbling with the handle, hoping for escape. But Max's presence blocked the path, his eyes locked, his posture perfect. And the lesson was clear. Boundaries exist for a reason. Trespass has consequences, and the line between observer and intruder is never to be crossed without consequence. And as the tension reached its peak, the moment stretched into what felt like an eternity. Karen, trapped by her own miscalculation, her audacity colliding with preparation and loyalty, and finally, with a cautious retreat, she backed out the way she had come. Every step watched, every move registered, leaving a trail of adrenaline, fear, and humiliation in her wake. And Max stood firm, surveying the space, ensuring that no further intrusion could occur. His presence a declaration that home is sacred, that protection is active, and that some lines, once crossed, will never be tolerated. And as I watched the security feed later, heart racing, relief flooding in, I realized that the silent guardian, the K-9 unit I trusted, had not only defended the physical boundaries of the home, but also the psychological peace that Karen had sought to disrupt, proving that preparation, vigilance, and loyalty are the strongest deterrents against those who believe rules and respect do not apply to them. Karen froze in the doorway, her eyes wide, chest heaving, the adrenaline coursing through her as she realized that her carefully planned intrusion had failed, that every step she had taken, every subtle move she thought invisible, had been detected, countered, and exposed by Max, whose presence was unwavering. His gaze locked on hers, growl low and steady, a warning that left no room for negotiation, no space for excuses, and she fumbled for words, trying to explain, to apologize, to claim misunderstanding, but the intensity in his stance, the precision in his movements, and the undeniable authority he projected rendered her speech meaningless, her polite demeanor shattered by fear, and the sound of barking from Max echoed through the house, sharp, commanding, drawing the attention of neighbors who began peering through windows, stepping onto lawns, voices calling out questions, and the sudden public attention only amplified her panic, revealing the stark contrast between her confidence before and the vulnerability now exposed. She took a step back, tripping slightly over the rug she had nearly ignored, hands raised instinctively in a gesture of surrender, eyes darting toward the doors and windows, finally realizing that her every assumption had been wrong, that the house was not an empty target, and that Max was not just a pet, but a guardian trained to enforce boundaries. And as the neighbors gathered, murmuring and pointing, some calling local authorities, she tried to maintain composure, but the fear in her eyes betrayed her, her every movement frantic, a stark display of miscalculation and overconfidence collapsing under the weight of reality. The sound of approaching sirens added to the tension, the subtle flashing of lights outside the house creating a cinematic intensity that made her hesitation even more dramatic. And when the officers arrived, Karen's excuses tumbled out in a nervous jumble, her voice high-pitched, defensive, pleading. But the evidence was undeniable. The security cameras, the motion sensors, Max's vigilant presence, All captured and documented the intrusion, and the law was clear. Boundaries had been crossed, trespass had occurred, and she would be held accountable, and in that moment, standing in the midst of chaos she had not anticipated, Karen experienced the full weight of consequence. The contrast between perceived control and actual vulnerability, a lesson reinforced by every neighbor witnessing her unraveling, by every flash of a camera, by every sharp growl from Max, who continued to assert the rules of this house with unwavering authority. Max circled slowly, eyes never leaving her, ensuring that no sudden movements could be made, that no further intrusion could occur, and I watched the security feed from my phone, heart pounding, adrenaline still high, pride swelling for my canine partner who had acted without hesitation, with perfect timing, and with the loyalty and intelligence that only a trained unit could provide. And it became clear that Karen's belief in her ability to bypass rules, to invade boundaries, had been completely dismantled, her overconfidence exposed, her plans foiled, and the neighborhood, once silent witnesses to subtle tension, had become active participants in holding her accountable, their presence reinforcing the social and moral boundaries she had attempted to ignore. The confrontation was over in minutes, but the impact lingered, a potent reminder that preparation and vigilance matter, that underestimating a K-9 unit or a committed homeowner can have serious consequences, and that some people, no matter how meticulous or clever, cannot overcome instinct, training, and a home defended with loyalty and strategy. And as Karen was escorted away, still muttering protests and promises of explanation, Max stood at attention, surveying the perimeter, his chest heaving slightly, tail moving with a controlled rhythm, eyes scanning for any residual threat, ensuring that the house, my sanctuary, remained secure. And in that moment, I realized that the bond between handler and K-9 is more than training. It is trust. It is instinct. It is a force multiplier against anyone who believes they can disrespect boundaries without consequence. And the lesson was clear, both for Karen and for anyone who might ever attempt to infringe upon the safety, privacy, and peace of my home. Max was ready, I was ready, and together we were unstoppable. After the chaos subsided and Karen was escorted away, the house felt different. Not just physically secure, but emotionally reinforced. The walls echoing with silence that was no longer tense but relieved. And Max, still alert but gradually relaxing, padded through the rooms, sniffing corners, ensuring no trace of intrusion remained, his tail wagging subtly, a quiet affirmation that the home was safe. And I walked through the house afterward, checking cameras, doors, and windows again, verifying that every precaution had held, every sensor had worked, and every detail of our defense plan had been executed flawlessly. And as I did, I realized the true weight of what had occurred, the audacity of someone like Karen, the risk she had posed, and the importance of preparation, vigilance, and the bond I shared with Max. The neighbors, who had witnessed parts of the confrontation, came over cautiously throughout the day, offering support, sharing relief, and expressing their astonishment at both the intrusion and Max's response, their voices carrying a mix of concern and admiration. And in those conversations, the subtle reality of living in a community governed by an HOA became clear, that rules and authority have limits, that vigilance cannot be replaced by policy, and that sometimes the only real deterrent is action and preparedness. The HOA followed up with official notices, carefully worded to remain neutral while documenting the incident. But their letters, emails, and calls now had a different tone, a recognition that boundaries had been violated, and while Karen would likely attempt to downplay her actions, the record was irrefutable, and I reviewed it all, saving emails, footage, and statements, creating a complete archive that proved the events exactly as they happened. The combination of technology and Max's instincts, leaving no room for doubt or reinterpretation. Emotionally, the relief was profound, the lingering anxiety replaced by confidence. The knowledge that no matter how meticulous or overbearing a neighbor might be, preparation and loyalty could safeguard both property and peace of mind. And as I watched Max settle into his favorite spot by the window, keeping one eye on the front yard and one ear tuned to distant sounds, I felt an immense gratitude for his presence, his training, and his unwavering focus, realizing that he had done more than protect a house. He had defended the intangible sense of security that comes from knowing your home is truly your sanctuary. Over the next few days, I reinforced minor security measures, reviewed camera angles, updated motion sensors, and double-checked all entry points, not out of fear, but out of respect for the lesson the incident had taught me, that vigilance is never complete, that even familiar spaces can be threatened, and that proactive preparation, paired with a loyal and trained K-9 unit, is a combination that cannot be underestimated, especially in neighborhoods where personal obsessions like Karen's can escalate into trespass and disruption. The legal process began subtly, the authorities following up with statements, verifying details, and ensuring that the trespass was documented and actionable. And while I had anticipated the paperwork, the reality of formal consequences for Karen offered an unexpected sense of closure, the assurance that the violation of my space would not be ignored, and that her actions had tangible repercussions beyond humiliation, beyond neighborly gossip, solidifying the principle that boundaries exist for a reason, and crossing them is never without cost. In the quiet moments that followed, I reflected on the experience, realizing how much of the tension had been psychological, the slow escalation of Karen's manipulations, the anticipation of intrusion, the constant alertness required, and yet the resolution showed the power of preparation, instinct, and courage, that even a subtle threat can be met decisively with the right tools and partnerships. And for anyone in similar situations, the lesson is clear: invest in your security. Train your protectors well, maintain vigilance, and trust your instincts, because the combination of preparation and loyalty will always prevail against overreach and intrusion. As the days returned to routine, Max remained vigilant, but the anxiety in his posture eased. The house regained its rhythm, and I regained mine. Each step a reminder that the home had survived, that boundaries had been enforced, that justice, quiet, firm, and effective, had been served. And in that moment, the neighborhood felt safer, not because rules were enforced by letters or HOA notices, but because the reality of consequence, preparation, and unwavering protection had been demonstrated. A lesson both for me and for anyone who might test the limits of intrusion in our community, proving that vigilance, courage, and loyalty are the strongest forms of security, and that even the most subtle manipulations can be met with decisive, effective action, leaving no doubt that the home, my sanctuary, was untouchable. As the dust settled and life returned to its normal rhythm, I couldn't help but reflect on the roller coaster of events that had unfolded. The tension, the fear, the adrenaline, and the undeniable relief. And while Karen's intrusion had tested every precaution I had taken, every routine Max and I maintained, it also revealed the strength of preparation, the power of instincts, and the loyalty of a partner who protects not just a home, but the peace that comes with ownership. And in those quiet moments, watching Max settle by the window, eyes scanning, ears alert but body relaxed, I realized that the lessons went far beyond security, far beyond neighborhood disputes, and touched on the very nature of boundaries, respect, and the lengths some people will go when obsession overrides consideration. The experience made me rethink the subtle power dynamics of suburban life, how polite smiles and HOA letters can mask overreach, how rules can be twisted to justify control, and how quickly small manipulations can escalate into real threats when vigilance lapses. And it reinforced something I had always known intuitively: trust your instincts. Protect what matters, and never underestimate the value of preparation, whether that means locks, cameras, motion sensors, or a loyal K-9 trained to respond instantly to danger. I began sharing my story with neighbors, not to boast or create fear, but to offer insight, to highlight the importance of proactive measures, and to show that even subtle threats can be met decisively with the right strategy and partnerships. And the response was incredible. Conversations sparked about home security, about HOA dynamics, about boundaries, about how far people might push if they believe there are no consequences. And the story spread, creating awareness, caution, and even a bit of admiration for Max, who had become the quiet hero of the neighborhood, embodying the principle that protection and preparation go hand in hand. Beyond the immediate threat, I reflected on the psychological impact, the stress of anticipating intrusion, the way it affects your perception of safety, and how quickly paranoia can creep in if you don't have a system in place to mitigate risk. And I realized that part of living in a community is understanding human nature, recognizing that some people, like Karen, may push boundaries not out of malice but out of compulsion, curiosity, or control, and that awareness allows you to prepare, to anticipate, to defend, and to maintain the peace and security that everyone deserves in their own home. Max became more than a pet. He became a symbol of resilience, of loyalty, of unwavering protection. And I began training him further, enhancing his skills, strengthening our routines, ensuring that no future intrusion, no matter how subtle, could ever succeed, and in doing so I found peace not only in the physical security of my home, but in the knowledge that preparation and vigilance create a sanctuary that cannot be easily disrupted. I also considered the broader implications of HOA dynamics, how rules, authority, and social pressure intersect, and how sometimes the most effective deterrent isn't policy. It's action, presence, and the visible confidence that your boundaries are defended. A lesson reinforced for every neighbor who witnessed, heard, or learned about the incident, and a reminder that respect is earned, not assumed. As I settled back into my routines, walking the neighborhood with Max, greeting familiar faces, checking locks, and monitoring cameras, I felt a sense of empowerment, a quiet satisfaction knowing that the home, my sanctuary, had been defended, boundaries had been enforced, and a message had been sent. Intrusion will not go unnoticed, and loyalty, vigilance, and preparedness always prevail. And while Karen's audacity had tested us, it ultimately highlighted the strength of trust, the effectiveness of strategy, and the irreplaceable bond between a guardian and their home. Looking back, I realized the story wasn't just about confrontation or security. It was about awareness, resilience, and the proactive steps we take to protect our lives, our spaces, and our peace of mind. And by sharing it, I hope others learn to recognize subtle threats, respect their instincts, and take action before small invasions escalate, understanding that a prepared mind and a loyal protector, whether human or canine, can transform fear into empowerment, uncertainty into control, and threats into lessons that reinforce the importance of boundaries, respect, and the enduring power of preparation. And as I watched Max curl up on the rug by the window, the sun streaming through the blinds, I smiled, knowing that together we had defended more than just a house. We had safeguarded the peace, security, and dignity that make a home a sanctuary, proving that vigilance, loyalty, and preparation are the ultimate defenses against anyone who believes rules, respect, and boundaries are optional, and that the story, though intense, ends with empowerment, awareness, and the quiet satisfaction that comes from knowing that no matter who tests you, no matter who tries to cross the line, the right preparation ensures that home, safety, and peace will always prevail.